And it says we're live, which is good. I have had some technical issues starting this up, but we are definitely in it now. This is a conversation with a couple people writing for the same publication I've written for, which I, need to say that to avoid FTC saying that I fucking didn't do ethical journalism or whatever, and also it'd be pretty hypocritical for somebody with Gamergate supporter in their bio to not talk about ethical journalism, so I used to write for this place. It's called Polyquads, and I'm possibly going to write another piece for them relatively soon on the global security state. We're going to see if anybody's willing to take essentially the neocon position that it would be necessary to take in order to oppose my stance against mass surveillance. But anyway, all of that aside, I'm going to share this on Facebook and Twitter. And all of my subscribers that hit the notification bell already know that we're starting. But this is a conversation that I've been wanting to have for a while. And it's also a conversation I've been wanting to have with multiple people for a while. Because I think it's an important one to have. I think the fact that most people have no idea how a civil conversation like this could work is a problem. And I want to sort of be that civil conversation. The guys behind Polyquads were already very happy with this prospect because they wanted to start off their publication with the idea of bringing people together for a talk. So I'm happy to be the person to facilitate that, and I hope I can give you guys a good experience today and show some people in America how people from Britain think about Britain. So with all of that in mind, this is brought to you by Liberty Under Attack Publications. And I want to stress this. If you get in relatively soon now, you can get a discount on their editing and proofreading. They have a sale going on, and they had one for Black Friday for like a percentage off the actual publications. But they're a publishing house focused on Liberty books, and they will take your book, but they will also help you proofread it and edit it for another publisher. So even if you don't want to go with them, you can still support these streams and everything that they do over there if you want. So all of that aside, it's also brought to you by Liberty Professionals, a private investigator and missing person skip tracing and more out of Virginia. He's an ASIS board-certified physical security professional, and he will help you get all of your shit secure. So please feel free to check out the sponsor links in the description for more. Also, in case somehow the EU decides that they want to fuck with your internet, there's going to be a link in there for ExpressVPN. I'm not 100% sponsored by them, but that link is a referral link through my links referral service. And if you decide you want to get ExpressVPN so that you can have more secure internet that's private from many sorts of people, including the snooping eyes of the European superstate, feel free to check that out. But with all that being said, I have with me Porn Panic from Twitter and Sexy Isn't Sexist from Twitter. Both of these people are here to tell us their views on Brexit. So why don't we get that started with you telling us where you stand, whether you're a leaver or a remainer from the gate, and then telling us a little bit about yourself. We'll start with you, Jerry.
Okay. Hi. So yeah, I'm Jerry Barnett, and as you said, Porn Panic on Twitter. And it's a strange Twitter name, but it's the title of my book, which is about pornography and identity politics and liberty and a bunch of stuff. So with regard to the EU and Brexit, I'm very much a Remainer, even though I think since the election last week, then such a thing doesn't really exist anymore because we know we're leaving. I'm pro EU as a concept. I'm very much a fan of Britain belonging to the European Union. But I come at this from a fairly liberal stroke libertarian position. And I think people will find that strange because most libertarians will tell you that the EU is a super state based in Brussels and it has a massive bureaucracy and it's centralized government. But I think there's a strong liberal argument for staying within the European Union, and I think we're losing as a nation by leaving the European Union.
All right. Well, that I think fairly succinctly states your stance. What do you have to say, Paula? What do you leave or remain? And tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I think that makes sense. I mean, after all, the people who wrote the Constitution of the United States of America were supporters of classical liberalism. Not sorry, I was going to say libertarian. And they tried to come up with a kind of a solution to a federalist state. Massive group of countries under a federalist state that allowed for those kind of individualist identities to exist within it. And I think the conditions within that those were developed were very different from what's happening in Europe now. So I voted Brexit. And I voted Brexit because I'm not a federalist. I'm not an American either. It gets complicated when you get to America and you get to the Constitution and stuff. That was a very different time. I think all better off really at the minute. I think we just have to kind of. I'm a great believer in just kind of watch and wait and see what happens, because there's a lot of hyperbole. There's just a lot of people cannot see what's in front of their eyes because they're still in a state of denial.
Well, and it probably doesn't help that they're like constantly bombarded by news from like exactly two different perspectives. Like you're either a BBCer or a Channel 4er, and it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of middle ground.
No, I think certainly a lot of the younger generation don't go to any of those for their news at all.
Would you?
The BBC
and to an extent, we've got a kind of four-way split. Instead of just leave and remain here, we've also got left and right, because the leave and remain camps cut across the left-right identities. So you'd say the left people are probably more pro-Remain, but there's a large part of the left which is very anti-European Union,
right?
Which sees it as a capitalist, neoliberal, pro-market, pro-trade union. And then on the other hand, on the right, you have, but it's also on the right, then there's kind of the opposite viewpoint, where you have the kind of the center-right people who are more pro-trade and pro-business will be pro-European Union. But then you have the further right people, the nationalists, who dislike the European Union because of free movements of people because it's increased migration, because they want to build that wall. There's that same kind of Trump tendency that they're kind of,
which is why there's a lot of concern about Boris.
Well, no one quite knows where he sits.
Yeah. Well, this is a fairly free-form conversation. If you think something needs to be said, feel free to say it. Try not to interrupt people, but definitely feel free to say whatever you need to.
Okay. What I would say is kind of, and this has been happening for a few years now, the idea of being right, far right, right-leaning is all a bit very mushy. It's generally a pejorative kind of term within what we have in England, certainly in the mainstream media. To say that you are right wing means that you are a Nazi, which doesn't kind of correspond to any kind of. Basically, you're a Tory. That doesn't mean you're a Nazi. It doesn't mean that you're conservative fiscally and libertarian or liberal in any other kind of thing. Politics is a much more complex picture than the language you're using at the minute allows for. And generally, in the last certainly since Trump again, because I don't believe Trump. Trump loves Israel. Trump and he's not a right wing. Anything he might have things that you disagree with about him. Fair enough, but for you to be trying to say that he's a Nazi, to try to say that Boris Johnson is a Nazi, to try and say that, it just makes the term Nazi absolutely without any meaning whatsoever.
But I think it's important to identify there are kind of two tribes of anti-EU people. The people on the left, from the kind of communist wing, think that the EU is a capitalist neoliberal, forcing markets into the UK and so on, undermine labour laws. The people on the right see the EU as a bureaucratic socialist type state that's forcing immigrants and on us and so on. So you've got two separate groups of people who hate the EU for almost opposite reasons, and to an extent they're both right, because the EU is a kind of layer of government and bureaucracy, and it has increased migration.
Let's assume that the EU, which is this massive super state of bureaucracy, which it is that, actually agree. What kind of machinations are happening within that kind of environment in Brussels?
I mean,
is beyond that, really.
If I'm not mistaken, I think the Vogons in Hitchhiker's Guide were built after the EU.
It's a long. I've read Hitchhiker's Guide, and I can't remember who the Vogons were, because it was a very long time ago.
They were those aliens who were really bad at poetry, and they were the ones who were building the constructor fleet to destruct Earth and build the intergalactic superhighway.
Yeah, they were just kind of bureaucrats. They were just really dumb bureaucrats that just did whatever was on the sheet told them to do. Yeah. That's the nature of bureaucracy, but the EU bureaucracy does a number of different things, because you can equate it to the US government.
Well, Alaska for a better example, rather than, bless him, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is great, but and so is Harry Potter. But let's try it.
I love Harry Potter.
I know, I love Harry Potter as well, but it's kind of.
I'm not a fan. I think the closest I get is like Fantastic Beasts these days. And it's not just because it's in America. It's also because it's like more mature and it cares a little bit more about being consistent.
Oh no, I think if you read Harry Potter with a political eye, you'll see it's basically about the rise of a fascist / communist superstate. And incidentally, what's her name? Rowling is pro-EU. So J.K. Rowling, she's pro-EU. I like her politically. Me and her kind of think alike.
I think she's got a brain on. I think she's ambivalent, and I'm not sure she knows what to think at the minute. And I think she's reassessing things.
I kind of feel like J.K. would be the opposite person to talk about thinking in terms of politics, though, because she seems to ride public sentiment a bit, and she'll change characters after the fact. I mean,
she's done quite a good job at obsessing people on Twitter.
Yeah,
she's a creative. She's a writer. And Twitter is a great place for writers. It really is.
Yeah, Stephen King is on there, and he regularly pisses people off.
Oh, absolutely. Just to play games and just to put out things, ideas that might be right, might be wrong. You phrase them in a certain way, and honestly, the drama happens, and you kind of Twitter's a great place for that.
Well, and it's sort of like a Petri dish where you can test out different things. You just put a little thing out there, and the reaction to that can tell you a lot about the way current sentiment is running. I think that's pretty cool if it's done right.
Yeah, I mean, I built a presence kind of as a left-wing blogger about 10, 12 years ago. And what was interesting was that as I built an audience pretty quickly, kind of 20,000 followers in a short amount of time. But it's very easy when you're preaching to your audience and they like you. And as I distanced myself from the left, and I saw the left changing, and I stopped appreciating the left and turned against identity politics and so on, I found myself in command of an audience that didn't like me, which was quite an interesting thing. You know, I built an audience as one person, and then they expected me to keep on saying the same stuff. So yeah, it's you know, your Twitter audience appreciates you for what you are, but you can't really change on them very much.
Yeah, well, and that's why they're so upset at me for going against Trump as hard as I went against Obama. They're super mad about that. I wanted to ask you, though, you said in your article, which both of them are going to be linked in the description, but you said there's a rise in nationalist and anti-democratic sentiment in both parties and a surge of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party, which has traditionally been strongly anti-racist. I'm wondering what you meant by that. And I think now is a good time to say that, because not only myself, but others were interested in what you meant.
Those are two separate points. So the first is about the European Union introduced in 1992, I think, the concept of free movement between countries. So, and to me, that was always a beautiful thing. You know, to me, that's the most liberal of ideals, that you kind of magic away the borders and you can cross and not just visit, but work and that kind of thing. So the free movement thing to me is the biggest thing we're losing with Brexit. And to me, it was a high point, not just in recent history, but in the entirety of European history. Europe's history is a bunch of competing nations that continually fight with each other, and that's part of what has made Europe great. That constant competition and constantly needing to get there before France or the Netherlands or Spain or whatever. That's what drove Europe and the European empires to greatness, was that level of intense competition. But for the first time in European history, there was effectively this empire that covers now 28 countries, and this ability to move everywhere, to me, is great. But it's also obviously gonna worry and upset some people, because it's not just us that have the right to travel everywhere in the EU. It's people from 27 other countries have the right to come here and settle and start working with the minimum of bureaucracy. And obviously not everybody enjoys that, and there may be good reasons they don't enjoy that. It's not fair to start calling people racist or whatever, as
maybe
often
jingoist
happens in the discourse. No, not even. Jingoism is more about kind of war, but it's definitely, the word nationalist applies, because it's about feeling your borders are being breached. It's a very primitive human feeling that you're kind of feeling insecure because suddenly the borders are being breached with the big wide world. And I think Britain has, if you think of Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, Britain is the Shire, and Britain has this feeling that we're always slightly safer and slightly separate from all the shit that happens in mainland Europe, and separated by this 21 miles of water. And it's this very deep historic kind of level of, fear is a strong word, but
in-group out-group bias.
Sorry?
In-group out-group bias.
Yeah, I mean, just we're an island, and people in 1992 there was this idea that our borders had been kind of popped, and people started coming across, and then in 2005 Eastern Europe joined, and all these people from these strange cultures that we'd hardly encountered, especially Poland, started coming in and settling in small towns. And you can understand that was uncomfortable for some people. So I don't want to, it's stupid to go around and start calling those people xenophobic or racist or whatever, but there was a discomfort And that's nationalism. That feeling is nationalism. That feeling that, like, our borders are too weak and they need to be strengthened. That's a very human reaction, and that's happened on both the right and the left of politics, and they express it in different ways, but they often feel the same, which is, by the way, why so many old industrial left-wing seats have suddenly swung to the Conservatives, because it's those small northern towns that maybe have been most affected, or at least are most fearful of this kind of what they see as a tide of new people coming in. So that was the nationalism comment. The anti-Semitism thing is a completely different process, and it is very weird, in which, because there's been a hijack of the Labour Party by the far left, by the political far left, but people who were always very niche in British politics now suddenly control it would be like communists suddenly taking over the Democratic Party. That's basically
implying they
what's
haven't
happened
already.
Yeah, I mean, well, not to the extent that Labour has.
Yeah,
Literally, it's
no, I'm
going
just
to the
being an
top.
ass.
Sure, and I mean, some of the same processes are happening in America, except because of a number of just almost procedural accidents. These people rose straight to the top of the Labour Party and then started cleansing, turning the Labour Party into what they wanted it to be. So there's been this kind of takeover of the Labour Party by a kind of extreme left-wing fringe. And along with them, there was a massive rise in membership, like 300,000 people joined in the space of a few months in 2015. And along with some of these people, my background's socialist, a lot of my family's socialists and so on. They're good people, and socialism and anti-racism often go hand in hand. But with a lot of these fringe groups came these really extreme people, and some of them may have even come from fascist groups, who joined the Labour Party and kind of bedded in. And you get suddenly this rise of anti-Semitism, which has barely been seen in the UK really in decades, not in this kind of way. And it's kind of linked to the left's deep dislike of Israel, but it goes much further than that, in which all Jews are seen as agents of Israel, and British Jews are agents of Israel, and so anything that Israel does is suddenly the fault of every Jew in the world. And it's this, but yeah, it's this thing that's gone from zero to pretty serious in 4 years, and it's kind of unrelated, except it's part of the earthquakes that are happening in British politics.
Yeah, it's a good thing to mention. Paula, you said you voted Brexit. That means you obviously voted for Boris. And I'm wondering, first off, what led to your decision? And second off, you say in your article, I voted for Brexit with some reservations, but would have accepted the result had it gone against me, trusting the democratic process would allow me another crack of the whip at some future point. Those wishing to subvert that process do not appear to have any understanding or respect of the mechanisms they would so casually revoke. I tend to agree with you in spirit in that regard, because when I saw a bunch of people going against Brexit when the referendum had already basically been agreed to, and I think at this point, twice, and when people have been continuously trying to make Brexit happen, and when you lost a prime minister over it, and she had that fucking tearful, weird reply when she was on her way out, I'm wondering exactly, like, first, again, what led you to vote for Brexit, and what led you to the decision that it would be okay if Brexit didn't happen?
Right. Okay. There's a few. You're going to have to remind me of some of those questions as I go along, because I tend to kind of, as I'm concentrating on stuff, forget the thread of things.
Yeah,
So if you can
no
help
problem. I'm exactly the same way.
So, yeah, I've already done it already. What's the first question you'd like me to ask?
The first question is, what led you to vote Conservative? What led you to vote for Boris and be pro-Brexit in the first place?
All right. Well, when I voted in the referendum, I wasn't voting Conservative, and there was a local election just after that, and I voted Libertarian. so yeah, but what I was voting for, and even to the up to the dot, the hour of casting your vote, I was asking people's opinions on Facebook and Twitter, and saying, I can see I'm not a big fan of federalism as it stands at European federalism. Absolutely not. The US federalism is a different animal altogether. But
Of course, it sucks too. But go ahead.
Okay, but certainly European federalism is a very different animal, and I had just massive reservations about the power of an unelected body of people in Brussels being able to levy taxes across borders to people who just had no say in why they were paying those taxes. We look at the issue of wars in Europe, they're all about taxation. They're all about people just trying to live their lives, just trying to get on with their lives, and people from higher kind of ground coming in and saying, no, you must pay for this, you must pay for that, you must then give me more money. And then the EU started to kind of come out with all these stuff about the EU army. It's kind of what? Well, no. So it was just really a kind of an instinctive, more than anything else, kind of thing of just saying, these Brussels have absolutely no idea about what their needs and the wants are of the peoples that they're trying to kind of have this umbrella rule over. That they just want to levy their taxes. They just want control over the money for whatever their actual agenda is, which we're not privy to, and we already have nation states and representational democracy to deal with that. So. Yeah,
so you basically have the same contention that the founders of America allegedly had, which is that it's taxation without representation, and it's also an unelected and unaccountable body of people who have no checks and balances on their power. That's what you're insinuating, right?
Seems to be, yeah.
Okay, because one thing I've noticed is that, like the Hong Kong shit that's going on right now, a lot of these non-American countries are sympathizing with American sentiment quite a bit. And what I noticed was in this particular election, people kept on referring to Boris as the European Trump, and treating him as though he was sort of the proxy for the nationalism and the sort of sovereignty and independence mindset of the stereotypical American right. So I'm wondering if that had some sort of like hinging impact on your decision. But I also want to know, like, the second part to the question was, and I'll remember this part for after you answer this. The second part to the question is, why would you be okay if Brexit didn't happen?
Well, none of those things you said before me about kind of Boris, Trump, the right, none of those things make any sense to me, because that's just hyperbole. It's kind of, none of it has any nuance to it. It's just Boris is right, Trump is right, as if that's somehow kind of a pejorative statement. I've got no idea what I'm supposed to be agreeing to there. Why would I be okay if the vote had gone against me? Well, because we live in a democracy, and the whole point about peaceful transfer of power is that we stop laughing, Jerry. No, the whole point is that we it's like football, right? It's like football. Even American football, English football, we have the leagues. You fight, you go on. The referees sometimes go with you, they go against you. But you know what? And somebody wins the cup and you think, God, we were robbed. But you know what? You're going to be able to go for the cup again next year. That's sport. And that's what politics is. It's sport. Right. When you take the sport out of it, then you get the hooligans coming on the pitch. Then you just get chaos.
That's
my
a
narrative.
reasonable assessment, actually. So you're saying that you would go with the results no matter what they were, because you would rather that society try to find a way to deal with a new paradigm than to drag it down to a level of it's my way or the highway.
Yes, which is what socialism is, or anarchism is, or all of those kinds of things. Our political institutions don't kind of exist randomly. I'm not gonna get ridiculously, pious about people dying and stuff, but it's true. The reason why we live at the pinnacle of civilization now is because of the trials and tribulations that we've gone through, our ancestors went through, and by look or by truck, left descendants to be here. For I don't know, for anarchists, for socialists, kind of think that they want to overrule what is happening now as they sit in their wonderful kind of apartments, even poor, they've got access to the internet, they've got hot running water, they've got, they live like kings. We live like kings now because of these mechanisms, because of these political mechanisms that allow a temporary, peaceful transfer of power. And it has to be temporary. People need to feel that they have another go. And that's why they exist. It's not random. This has gone through the crucible of human evolution itself, our social kind of systems. And millions and millions and billions of our ancestors have died to get to this point. And now, but we've still got people who think, I've got 30 years and I still want my way. So, okay, let's give them a stab in the ribs, let's do whatever we can. I want my way. And well, I'm sorry, no. Most people just want stability.
Yeah. I mean, I'd agree with that. And I'm a massive fan of democracy. And democracy is a really messy business, but that's because human society is messy and no two people can agree with each other on everything. We're just a bunch of slightly over-evolved apes, and we bump around against each other just like every other species, every other animal on the planet does. And it's a miracle that we've evolved these mechanisms for democracy is a mechanism. Democracy is a mechanism for stopping us fighting all the time. And so, as you say, is sport. That these things, we evolved these things to stop us just beating each other to pieces with rocks. Which is our normal way of doing things. So yeah, I think it's very important, and yeah, abiding by the results of elections and so on is massively important. I think with regard to the EU referendum specifically, there were a bunch of problems with it democratically. One is that we're not a direct democracy. We're not a nation that tends to decide stuff by referendum. We're a representative democracy, so we elect our representatives and they make decisions on our behalf. And I think that's a good way, a right way of doing things in most cases, because 99% of people can't possibly know everything that's got enough about everything that's going on to make decisions.
Because it was a direct democracy. That's why Athens fell. Athens was a direct democracy rather than a representative democracy, which is...
Yeah, and it's great. And so is California to an extent. So, to me, if you ask a question like, should cannabis be legalized? That's a good question, because that's a very, very concrete question. There's very little ambiguity, and it's a yes or no, and people understand what the question is. The question, do you want to leave the European Union, is full of ambiguity, full of confusion, and, and the fact is that no one quite knew what they were answering. So, for example, Northern Ireland is going to be, we know, just an example of the outcomes, we know Northern Ireland is going to be particularly badly hit economically. It may restart the sectarian violence that was going on for decades before it all came to a stop in the late 90s. It may break Northern Ireland away from the United Kingdom and force it to unite with the rest of Ireland.
That's interesting. Do you fear a resurgence of the IRA?
I think it's more likely than not, with the way we're going, because the key symbol that, what descended Northern Ireland into chaos was borders, and the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland, all of Northern Ireland is part of the UK and the rest of Ireland is a separate country. That's a very contentious border, and that created violence because, about half of the population of Northern Ireland is nationalist or Irish nationalist and wants to rejoin the rest of Ireland, and the other half originates in the UK and wants to stay part of the UK. And that resulted in civil war, and the only way that civil war was ended was because the European Union, because both Ireland and the UK joined the European Union, and suddenly that border was abolished by magic. Neither Ireland nor the UK could have done that. It was only by joining the European Union and joining the other 20-something countries in the European Union that conflict came to an end. So, just one of the many things coming out of out of Brexit is that Northern Ireland is now very insecure, and there will almost certainly be some level of rise in violence. We don't know how much, and we don't know where it's going to go. But the people of Northern Ireland voted 60-40 against Brexit. Now, so there are ethical questions. Do the people of the rest of the UK have the right to tell Northern Ireland that they're now basically, that their constitutional situation is changing, and that there may be a rise in violence, and that they may even have to leave the UK? That's a very difficult political question. I'd say, ethically, probably me sitting in London, I probably didn't have the constitutional right to make that decision on behalf of the people of Northern Ireland. But that's how complex Brexit is. It's not just a simple question about whether we're in the EU. It's a load of cascading effects that basically virtually none of us thought about during the referendum. And I don't think it was an ethical thing to even put a question like that on the table, because most people didn't know what was going on. And, just give you an example of a friend of mine, a much simpler example. A friend of mine kind of voted leave, and he mostly voted leave because he thought that Turkey was going to join the European Union. He was worried about millions of people from Turkey moving to the UK. Now, all of that was basically a myth. There's little prospect of Turkey joining the European Union at any time soon. And even then, there'll be some level of care to check that there's not massive immigration from Turkey and so on. But that was just a story. So he voted mostly for that reason. And then the next day after the referendum, the pound fell, and this same guy was going on vacation. And suddenly we found that our currency was worth 10 or 20% less than it had been the day before. And he was pissed off because suddenly going on vacation was costing him more. And he, this is a regular guy. He hasn't thought through all of these issues in any level of detail, but he voted leave based on a myth that was propagated during the referendum, and then changed his mind the next day because he found out that his vacations were going to get more expensive. But this was a massively complex issue put in a referendum, and I don't think it was the right thing to do. I don't think it was fair to do it that way.
So
remember, Ireland itself,
go ahead.
Ireland voted to leave the EU, but wasn't allowed to. The state of Ireland.
No, they had a referendum on the European Constitution, and they voted against, and then it was put back to them. Yeah, so I mean, this isn't fair or right, and there are issues about democracy. There are all sorts of questions, but Northern Ireland for sure didn't want to leave the EU. Gibraltar, another example is Gibraltar.
Northern Ireland didn't want to leave the EU because I've seen the maps, the demographic of what's voted, and Ireland is pretty much divided. Half of Northern Ireland did want to leave the EU, and half
It was about 60-40 in Northern Ireland.
And as we were just saying before we went on there about kind of those kind of anarchist groups like Antifa, who were just generally made up of men and a minority of women who just want in the Batman term, world on fire. They will try to use that to whatever they can. They want the world to be on fire. And
that's how Northern Ireland descended into violence. You had bunches.
That's the past. We're not talking about the present. That's not happening now.
Those same groups are there. The IRA, the unionists and the nationalists. There are people.
The bill is there to follow them is completely.
But there's another example which is even more extreme, which is the case of Gibraltar. Now, Gibraltar is one of these weird, as I said, Europe's divided into loads of different little states. Gibraltar is a little peninsula on the south coast of Spain, which for historical reasons is British, and the population is British, and they vote in British elections. Now, Gibraltar voted 90% to stay in the EU because Gibraltar is this little peninsula. They only have one border, and it's with Spain. And the minute that Britain is outside the EU, Gibraltar has a hard border with Spain. And I think the population of Gibraltar is like 30,000 people or something. It's small. But these people are now stuck. If the border with Spain is closed, then they could lose their jobs, their economy could die.
That's the bogeyman, isn't it? The hard border. And there's no consensus that there will have to be a hard border between.
We don't know,
or Gibraltar or Spain, but that's the bogeyman. That's been that's the.
No, we don't know, and it's kind of it's the kind of stuff you don't play with. But the people of Gibraltar have a fairly good idea and voted 90% to remain, because the border's been closed before. Britain has had disputes with Spain, and as soon as they do,
Spain have kind of things going on within their borders, yeah.
They do, yeah. But as soon as Britain and Spain joined the EU, it was now illegal for Spain to close the border with Gibraltar. So again, people need
still sort out all these things out politically without violence.
We might do, but
is the way to do it.
We've got to remember that for Europe, we have just lived through the longest period of peace in the entirety of European history. For Americans, it's kind of different. The last thing that happened was the Civil War. Europe, it was 1945, since 1945. Sorry?
Not the Yugoslavians or the Bosnians or,
Oh, no, for sure.
That happened there, which was on the basis of ethno-nationalism rather than cultural nationalism.
Yeah, and it's something that the EU has done, has created, progress where there's been that kind of thing, but it's within the EU, we have had the longest period of peace we've had the longest period of peace in history, and saying, oh, well, we might not go back to constant warfare is not a very reassuring message. And again, you talk about ethno-nationalism. The Czech Republic has massive history of discrimination against gypsies against Czech, gypsies who live within the Czech Republic. The European Union, it's only by joining the European Union that basically that human rights laws and protections of the gypsies have come in the Czech Republic. If the Czech Republic leaves the European Union, they'll go back to not long ago when the gypsies were very much second-class citizens and terribly treated. And I've seen that myself.
Rather than kind of saying we must all respect each other as a massive superstate, is respecting one another's boundaries as your ethnic identity and promoting tolerance within that, rather than saying we're all the same, admit that we're all different, and admit that within the laws of the liberal democracy that we're living with, we all have the same law, the same rights within the law. Neither one has any more or any less, but we respect those boundaries within people, within whether they are, Muslim, Gypsy, Christian. We get to the real hub of it, whether it's kind of like whether liberalism actually means a diffusion of boundaries, or it means respect of boundaries. Which one is it? And I think human nature will always come down on the side of groups, smaller communities want respect for their boundaries. If you try to erase those boundaries, then the human nature will find other ways to conflict and fight people.
Well, okay, so that's an interesting jump off point. Because, for instance, California wants to be like 3 states. Like, not most of it. Like, most people are just trying to get through their fucking day. But, like, there's a significant amount of people in California who want to split it into 3 different states and have, like, sort of Northern California, Middle California, and Southern California be separate states. And they want to do that because they think that it'll help isolate the political groups without gerrymandering between the sort of rural Californians, the urban Californians, the urbanite Californians who like worship technocracy, etc. I don't necessarily agree with that, and I don't think that's necessarily a solution. But in this particular case, what it sounds like is there's an enveloping series of issues involving leave or remain. And a key envelope in this issue appears to be the conjoining of the sort of Britain and Ireland, and the idea of Great Britain seems to be a sticking point to begin with. The idea that that these 2 culturally relatively distinct groups have to be in the same general like political alignment, and one of them leaving means all of them leave. So would you say that maybe a Brexit could only affect Britons rather than Ireland if maybe Ireland was no longer conjoined politically with the 2? Do you think that would help, and if not, why?
I think the problem is we've got a lot of history here, and Britain, Ireland's been a European. Ireland was a British colony for I don't know how many centuries, 6 centuries or something.
Yeah, about there.
So, and then by the 20th century, there were a lot of Protestants living in the north who mostly came from Scotland originally, I think, but even they'd been there for like centuries. And so the only way for Ireland to get independence when Britain was withdrawing and from its empire was to break off Northern Ireland and keep it as a part of the UK. And that, of course, then triggered its own problems. As I said, it was the existence of the European Union and the fact that the European Union's basically eradicated borders within its territory that ended that civil war that had been going on basically for 6 centuries before that in one way or another.
Right.
And I suspect if you have these tensions between Californians, which are probably mostly funny, so this idea of breaking California up, generally most people don't take very seriously, and you'll have just cultural differences, and you can probably joke about them in comedy clubs or whatever. If California left the United States and then broke into 3 states, you'd then have the serious prospects of warfare, you'd then have to work out how trade works across those borders. You guys have a border around California, which you don't even think about. I've been between California and Nevada, and there's no border control, there's no passport checks, all of that stuff. Imagine if a border actually now appeared, and you then have police and military and all the stuff that you need to look after a border. This is why I think libertarians who are pro-Brexit have got it wrong, because borders borders need a security state. They need police, spies, secret police. They have censorship. They often censor the internet as it crosses the border. This kind of thing. Borders, when you make a border real, that has consequences. And imagine having to go through a police check or an army check if you decided to drive to Nevada or Arizona or wherever you are.
Borders would exist within peoples, whether you created them on a map or not, because the borders would, within communities, within people who you can trust, within people who you know, with it that you can trade with, and won't be kind of cheated on. These are where borders come from. These are where official borders on the map come from, between kind of trading partners who understand and have deals with them. They're not just some kind of arbitrary kind of top-down thing. That basically, it's aren't. I might be wrong. Aren't loads of Californians moving to Texas now? Was that not a thing?
Well, see, it's kind of because of that lack of verifiable border, which first off, I'll get to something involving that shortly, but because of that, there's a permeability to all of the state's sort of cell walls. And they're basically cells in the same big organism. And so, there are a certain amount of people leaving California, but there are also a certain amount of people coming in. For instance, I recently covered how California is not, as people had mythologically said it was, the storage place for most of the U.S. homeless. They claimed that most of the U.S. homelessness was in California, which is patently false. It's about 20%. And that sounds bad, but it's also got the most populous cities of any state, and it carries some of the most surface area of any state. So it kind of makes sense that this giant, unnecessarily large strip on the west side of the U.S. would have a significantly higher percentage of homeless people and people in economic duress, especially because of those urban areas and because of how cruel cities can be to those in need. But there's also this other aspect in terms of the border situation here. We have what are jokingly referred to, and the joke is a real bitter joke because almost nobody likes these constitution-free zones. The ACLU, for instance, calls these zones constitution-free zones because in about a 100-mile strip along every part of the national border, you can be detained by Border Patrol. The border zone...
That's the border with Mexico, right?
Well, the border with everything, actually. Canada included, the oceans included, the Gulf of Mexico, all of it. There's this just strip. Think of a really good steak and that fat on the side. That's what it looks like in that kind of ring of just no constitution applies here because you could be an illegal. Right. We can stop you, we can create checkpoints, etc. So if California broke off, that big fuck you border zone would actually increase.
It would go all the way around California, and that's where Britain is heading. This is where Brexit inevitably leads us because, you need more border police, you need more customs controls.
We need to be readjusting our policies, procedures, defences with regards to the changing environment around us. Of course things are going to change, but none of us know whether this is going to be for good or bad.
But that it means more state, a bigger state.
What we have in the UK, I don't call it Great Britain. I don't know anybody who calls it Great Britain other than in kind of the UK. We have the NHS, which is a socialist kind of model of healthcare, which is absolutely vulnerable to massive exploitation, to open borders. It cannot survive that model cannot survive in open borders, and just simply having that conversation would be good. Would just be good to say, yes, we all love having the NHS, but it is simply not sustainable with an idea of open borders. No, it's just not. If you want to kill the NHS, if you care about, then open your borders, because everybody will come to exploit that. Human beings are not saints. We're humans. And they will come to exploit that, and that will be the end of the NHS.
Well, there's a saying in libertarian anarchist circles, you can't have both open borders and a welfare state. So I think you might agree with that.
Well, I think that comes from an evolutionary observation. Really, it's not particularly anything to do with any kind of political ideology. And in evolutionary theory, we have something called cheat detection, which is something that humans are endowed with, pre-language, and that's where that kind of idea comes from. But yes, absolutely. Once you open yourself up, like Jesus, maybe, I don't know, you are going to attract, that 2% of the population who are psychopaths, who have sociopathic kind of dark triad.
These people exist somewhere anyway, so
But even at such small bits within the population, if you create a system where they can come in and totally exploit a situation, they can upend it. And
this is why you can't have a union between very different states. So, but the fact that most if not all of the countries in the European Union have generous state-run healthcare systems. Some of them better than our own. So, I mean, that's why the European Union couldn't just go and admit Turkey or Morocco or other states that don't have those kind of services.
Reasons why people living in these states, are wanting to maintain the level of civilization, the level of what we have, and it's not them being racist, not them being xenophobic, not them. It's trying to kind of understanding that within human nature there is a tendency to exploit things.
Sure, we don't
person. That's just human nature. And refusal to understand human nature means that that will happen inevitably.
Sure. So you need systems to control that kind of thing. But let's say if California wanted to introduce a universal healthcare system, it would then need to worry about who qualifies, how long you've lived in California. Do you have to work in California for 2 years before you access it? You need to set the rules, but that doesn't mean you can't do it. You just need
hierarchy, which is something that neither libertarianism, anarchism, all of those things are very naive about human nature, because they think in a natural state, human nature is all fair and beautiful. It's not. It's really
hang on.
not.
Let me just reality check here, which is that in the nearly 30 years since the EU's had open borders, none of this. Like the outcomes have been broadly positive. There haven't been negative outcomes. There have been negative outcomes in terms of some communities feeling threatened and so on. But in terms of welfare,
isn't representative of anything in a human timescale. Nothing.
I mean, the other way to turn it back, besides looking at the US, for example, we could look at, let's not forget Britain is an artificial union as well. Britain is a union of 3 countries: England, Wales, Scotland. Under
that, Monica, we stopped ethnic wars. We stopped under a national.
So as the European Union.
We stopped ethnic war between Wales, Scotland, and England.
Right, which is the same reason for the European Union to come into existence. We had
But
this
no, talking
very
about a massive superstate there, not an island.
I mean, one of the reasons the European Union was created was because Germany had the tendency to go off on on imperialist adventures every now and then. But before England, Scotland, and Wales were a union, then England wasn't a country. England was a set of warring principalities that constantly, went to war with each other. And England was only united like 1,000 years ago. I think England and Wales about 600 years ago, Scotland about 400 years ago. These are all unions of different cultures.
Yeah.
And the point is, as you say, the purpose of these unions, they've created peace. You replace warfare with trade and cultural interchange and so on.
To that union, okay, it's not. You can't be endlessly expansionist and expect it to work within human nature, and certainly within the Industrial Revolution and all that kind of thing that stopped kind of warring in medieval England, where people could find a much more kind of cohesive kind of identity. There's still, this is again coming back to the sports analogy. I live in Gateshead. I come from Durham, but Newcastle, the rivalry between the football teams of Newcastle and Sunderland, which were royalist and unionist, like going back 500 years, that still is there, and it's still allowed to be expressed, but it's allowed to be expressed in healthy ways.
Yeah,
and
but only
manageable
because they're under a single government. That's what's made the difference.
Mechanisms in the European Union for that whatsoever.
But that's what it's done. I mean, the reason Sunderland and Newcastle don't go to war is because they're both ruled from London. And if they did go to war, the British Army would go in and stop it. The reason that the war between English principalities stopped was because the Norman army arrived from France and basically imposed peace on the warring English. This is history over and over again. And this is
1,000 years ago, or even 100 years ago.
Well, have we forgotten what Europe did? Have we forgotten how Europe was before the European Union? And like the general position that but that was then. Like Europe tore itself to pieces.
Your analysis then. How many years of peace have we had in Europe?
60, 70 within the European Union, yeah.
So is that since the European Union, since 1972?
The European Union has kind of grown in power and in size over time, but there hasn't been war within the European Union.
The European Union after the Second World War, before the European Union was there.
No, I mean it began as a common community, I think steel and coal community, and then it became the European Economic Community, and then it became the European Union. But the point is, as we've agreed, the totality of human history, is, well, you can look at there are these graphs showing wars over time in Europe. There has never been a period of peace in Europe for as long as there has been over the last 60, 70 years ever in history. And, we forget that there were concentration camps there in living people's lifetimes. There were almost 70 million people died in World War II around the world, and then World War I before that. And kind of, the idea that it could happen again is based on the fact that we've just forgotten.
No, people forget because, the reason why wars happen again and again and again, each generation, is because that generation dies, right? And our thoughts and our memories and the lessons we've learned are not passed on to the new generation, right? So they need to be, especially in politics, we need to understand the limits of human nature. We can push and ameliorate as much as we want, but we are going to come up against a ceiling where suddenly we start ruining things, and just progressivism for the sake of progressivism is pushing us towards catastrophe.
Okay, so
Yeah.
two replies. Because first off, I want to get this out there. Even though I am a distinct minority in terms of attitude and feeling among anarchists and libertarians, one thing I can tell you is that I don't think people are great. I think they naturally suck. I'm a pessimistic, cynical asshole, and the reason I don't want them to have power is because I think they'll misuse it. But
Well,
that's
I think you're confused then about your political ideology, because that's not what that's not, certainly not what Emma Goldman thought, or what anarchists think. Anarchism believes, certainly the ideology of it believes, that at heart people are good, and if you leave them to their natural inclinations, everything will be in harmony. It's
Emma
the
did.
same flaw that's in communism.
Emma did, but not most of the French anarchists. Not Spooner, not Bakunin or Kropotkin or Proudhon, not any of these like people who came out of the sort of 19th century end run of finding out how libertarianism and anarchism should look. Most of them thought that people weren't suited to power. And that's the reason they came up with a decent chunk of their thing. Like No Treason by Lysander Spooner is a great read that I would recommend everybody read.
In the way that Plato thought, that if we just do this and that and the other, then people will be good.
Well, Plato wasn't an anarchist, though.
I'm more Sophoclean, so yeah.
But either way, the thing I was going to bring up was that, I'd be interested in both of your answers on this, is that, like, I attribute a significant portion of our so-called peace to the fact that war is held in third world. It's held in other countries. Globalism has led to a trade level where there are bases established by countries in countries that have never attacked those countries, and those military operations lead to a foothold for trade that creates generally conflict in places that might not otherwise have it. Lots of regime change, lots of people playing kingmaker, and personally, like, one of the reasons I supported Brexit philosophically is because the idea of centralization and being a formative member of a political union, typically to me what that implies is that union gets to make the decisions regardless of what people on a local level want. And that's one of the things that seems to lead to this sort of globalization of trade and generally the military-industrial complex, is that we must protect our allies, we must protect our strategic partners, and we must keep ourselves overseas and in other people's countries so that we can maintain a foothold in the global marketplace. So I'm wondering if first off, either of you agree with that, and also second off, if you would be in favor of a gradual drawdown of what could be termed the hegemony of the UN allies.
I mean, my view is that nation states are an interim state in the development of humanity, and that and that they can be abolished, and we can return to a kind of border-free world that we had largely a few centuries ago. So I'm not a fan of the nation state, and I believe the fewer borders there are, the better. And so now, in order to do that, as we've seen with the United States and its federal government, or the European Union and its bureaucracy, you need a level of government and bureaucracy at that top level. But that doesn't mean that you push all power up to the top. That doesn't preclude localism. And one of the things that's happened in Britain and most of Europe over the last 30 years is that you've had power actually moving in two directions. You've had some power moving up to the European level, but we've also had devolution. So in Britain, we've had the creation of a Scottish Parliament, of a Welsh Parliament, of mayors in London and Manchester and other cities with more power. So so I live in London, and it's it's not either or, it's both. In London, to an extent, we've delegated some national power up to Brussels, but at the same time, some national power has moved down to the London mayor. And, to me, those things aren't mutually exclusive. And the more you can push power down to cities, towns, communities, the better. But that, so the idea that all power is being sucked up into the UN, NATO, the European Union, the World Trade Organization, whatever, isn't true. I think you need bodies at that level, but you also prevent any more power than necessary going up to that level. And nation states have to lose sovereignty if they want to trade. And this is a fundamental, rule of history. This has always happened. If countries want to trade with the world, and Britain was the biggest trading country in the world during its imperial days, they have to surrender their own sovereignty. And even during the British Empire, when Britain was the top dog in the empire, Britain had to surrender sovereignty, and Britain introduced free movement for the citizens of its empire. There were people from India went to Africa, people from Africa, were educated in London and Oxford and Cambridge, and so you get these freedoms and this border-free world at the expense of surrendering sovereignty. And kind of to an extent, what we're going through now, the decline of the British Empire after World War II led to this. First of all, there was the beginning of mass immigration from the old colonies, which then led to an anti-immigration sentiment, which led to harder borders, and we're still going through that, and to an extent, anti-immigration sentiment is at a high in the UK. This isn't a new thing. But yeah, I don't believe that these global bodies are bad. I believe they're necessary as part of liberating us of nation states. I think nation states, when they're young, serve useful purposes. As they age, they become belligerent towards the rest of the world. And the best thing is to build trade relationships and to avoid them going to war with each other.
Well, see, it's interesting that you phrase it that way because, first off, you say you come from a social justice background, and "we" is a pretty clearly delineatable term in this particular context because we are all white people. So how are we affecting other nations is a good question to ask. And what I've seen significantly is that people ignore the impact of global trade and global, presences of the first world and third world nations. They ignore how parasitic that can often be, and how oftentimes people can abuse their relationship with an allegedly weaker nation in order to solidify trade relations. So I wonder what you think of that.
That was a model that I used to have when I was on the political left, and over time I've moved away from that model. Firstly, because it hasn't represented the reality of what's gone on. Most of the poorest countries in the world are vastly wealthier than they were 20, 30 years ago as a result of globalization. So this idea that we had on the left, 30 years ago, and I was active on the left 30 or more years ago, we had the idea that globalization would result in wealth being sucked out of poor countries by rich countries. It didn't go that way. It went the other way. China in 40 years gone from 90% poverty levels to 10% poverty levels. Similar has happened in India and Latin America. Africa, I know fairly well. I've traveled in Africa, and my wife's Nigerian, and the increase in wealth, at least in the peaceful parts of Africa, has been massive. So there's this kind of hand-wringing on the Western left about how terrible we are and how we impoverish other societies that we come into contact with. And that doesn't actually seem to be the reality. It's the reverse. For the first time, we've seen, Africans with wealth traveling the world, arriving in London and New York and as tourists. When I was growing up, Africa was just seen as a dirt poor place where, the poorest of the poor, and you couldn't imagine Africans, really kind of traveling and and engaging with the world in the same way as the Europeans and Americans and Japanese did. Now that isn't the case. Nigeria is a future super wealthy country. It's like coming up 200 million people. Its wealth is growing massively. Its living standards are rising massively. The same for Ghana. The same for, I mean, there are 50 odd something African countries. A high proportion of them have very fast growing living standards. So that model, which is a left-wing model, just didn't stand up to the test of time. And if you just go and Google any graph on global poverty levels, you'll see that global poverty has collapsed in the last 20, 30 years. It's one of the most stunning achievements of mankind. And yet almost no one wants to talk about it because it's just crashed into so many people's narratives, including my old narrative. So I generally feel globalization is a good thing and trade is a good thing, and trade is generally good mutually. It tends to enrich both sides. So that model of I'm fairly pro globalization and global trade because that kind of those doomsday scenarios just didn't turn out in practice.
Well, okay, what would you say?
Absolutely. I'd agree with Jerry. Absolutely. You said it better than I ever could. The only thing I would add to that is just to just add in, Aristotle's golden mean and just respect boundaries within that at the same time. And, we have the algorithms to do it from history. So what we need less of are revolutionaries every generation thinking they can do it. Actually, that all of the information is there for us to do it properly, and just obey the golden mean. Moderation.
Let me ask you specifically, because one of the primary reasons I brought this up is that a chief complaint among nationalists and generally pro-Brexit people is that people do better on an isolationist regime. They do better on a regime that focuses more on a national level and focuses less on making other nations happy, making allies with other nations, and focuses more on caring for the needs of the individual citizens of a nation. And one of the things that I noticed significantly from pro-Brexit people, the people who were definitely in the Leave camp, a lot of them were there because they thought their needs weren't being met at the expense of fighting for, the needs of foreigners. That's the reason the immigration thing was so heavy in there. And so I wanted to get your specific perspective on the hegemony thing, because the idea of hegemony is directly counter to the idea of Brexit.
All right, I don't know what you mean about hegemony. What I was going to say, particularly, is that these things are facultative, which are that people are going to make decisions based on the reality that they're living at the moment. So if things are going to be, if things are going well, if they're not living through austerity or anything like that, they're not being overtaxed. They feel that. They're going to be much more kind of liberal and much more kind of opening and things like that. But listen, there are limits within human nature, and I know that you don't ascribe to kind of human nature and stuff like that. But let's just say that there is a broad,
we'll make the academic postulation that it exists for the purposes of this discussion.
And that says, within this broad kind of environment, that there are many things to discover, but that there are limits to it, right? We don't know what those limits are, but let's just begin with the thing of saying, that there are limits to it. Like, you wouldn't put a tiger in a cage and feed it tofu and expect it to thrive, because there is no tiger nature, right? That tiger would die, right? Humans are animals in the same way that tigers are animals. Just because we have a much more kind of broad and facultative and immense kind of tableau of culture than tigers do, does not mean that there aren't kind of healthy limits that we should kind of respect and boundaries that we should respect within that, within that kind of environment, respecting difference within it, but let's not try to kind of remap it to the just for the sake of progressivism, because that will, undo everything. I'm afraid I'm going to have to go.
Yeah. I know you had to go to sleep relatively soon. Okay, so if you decide you want to stick around, that's fine. We've just got a few questions from chat that I wanted to address before people left. But if you do need to leave, that's totally acceptable.
Okay, I'll get 5 minutes.
Okay, 5 minutes is probably enough.
Have a young Popathon before the new Popathon.
Gotcha. So Daniel says Jeremy Corbyn literally wrote the foreword to a book denigrating the Jews. There's also a tie to the socialists in labor to believe the greedy merchant trope. Mind hitting on that, either of you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm Jewish. I should add as well. But yeah, I mean, he did. The question of how anti-Semitic Jeremy Corbyn is a difficult one, but certainly there's been a rise in anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, very steep rise. I think the main problem with Jeremy Corbyn is he's not as intelligent as people seem to think he is, and I don't think he grasps a lot of issues that people assume he should understand. So, whether he's anti-Semitic or whether he's simply been a vessel for this happening is unclear. But yeah, I mean, he's certainly said some strange things, and pretty much all left-wing Jews have left the Labour Party, the vast majority.
I think it's my kind of my opinion on it is that Jeremy Corbyn has been held in power to kind of maintain this kind of chaotic holding pattern, which makes them. He doesn't need to be aware that that's what he's there for, and I don't know what they're waiting for to come forward. But
I think
at the minute,
I mean, the way that the far left work, the far left is comprised of 1,000 different feuding tribes. So the reason he's there is probably because they can't decide who should take over next. But when he steps down, the civil war that's about to unleash in the Labour Party is massive, because there's a million different varieties of communism, and we're about to see them all fighting each other for power.
Yeah, the momentum did become a very toxic element within the Labour Party, though.
Right. Well, so the other really, I think, important thing to bring up is that just look at Spain. They can't let Catalonia go because it's a huge portion of their taxes. Same is true for, I think he's saying California. And I think what he's trying to say is that these unions are largely preserved as a way to isolate taxes in the hands of people who don't have to be accountable to them. So would you agree with that, either of you?
I mean, I think unions are generally a good thing, but it's typically the wealthier members of unions that are going to want to leave before the poorer members.
Yeah, I think again, you can obey the golden mean, within the boundaries of human nature, and we'll find our answer.
Okay, so is there anything either of you would like to say before this ends?
It's been, I mean, this is a fascinating discussion. I think where we're at now, I mean, I've been one of those people kind of campaigning for a second referendum and wanting to take this to the people again. We're just in this last election, the election of Boris Johnson, has changed all of that. So we now know we're leaving the European Union, and there's a fatalism about it. The mood is completely different from what it was a couple of weeks ago. I've been very pessimistic about it, and now I'm just having to suppress my pessimism, because you can't be pessimistic about something that's definitely going to happen. You just have to wait for it to unfold and see what the next step is. But it's all going to get very strange. And so far, we've got to remember that
And
Brexit hasn't started yet.
And if we have the Tories in power now, who hopefully will be championing those classical liberal principles, of they'll be championing that you will have another chance, to win the cup. So
I would. Oh, one point I was going to make earlier as well. On the comparison between Donald Trump and Boris Johnson, I agree. It's a very crude comparison. It's not that good. Actually, I think.
So it looks like Jerry froze. So, and well, it looks like this is about where we would have cut off anyway. Um, I like it. It looks like I froze it on purpose. I promise I did not. But
no, I was going to say something we'd all agree with. Then I think.
Yeah, probably. Because I think people use Trump as a scapegoat for a lot of their hatred of politics of a lot of varying sorts. I mean, hell, I've been compared to Trump on multiple occasions because I'm crass and, generally not very polite. So, but go ahead, because you're unfrozen at this point.
This is me. You can hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. The point I was going to make was a very simple one, that actually there may be more in common between Donald Trump and Jeremy Corbyn than there is between Donald Trump and Boris Johnson. But people don't get that because they see things in terms of left and right. But Corbyn has some of the same instincts as Donald Trump in terms of being economic nationalist, in terms of distrusting global structures like the EU and NATO and so on.
Yeah, and I think Corbyn and Steve King would probably get along relatively well. So, okay, so is there anything else you guys would like to say? This is your closing statement moment.
I just did my closing statement. I'm good. But yeah, I've appreciated coming on, and it's a subject we never tire of talking about.
Gotcha. Well, maybe we'll come back on at a later point, because I know I've got some people from other parts of the EU who are very interested in discussing this, and also other parts of the UK in general. So there's a possibility this discussion could get much broader if you guys are down. But either way, I want to have these sorts of conversations, even though I disagree on multiple points both of you made. I think it's valuable to have the perspectives out there. And the fact that most people aren't willing to have conversations like these, especially across the pond, is very problematic. So I hope that this brings value to some people's lives and also helps them understand these issues from more than a crystallized single perspective that they're used to. So where can people find you both?
Go on, ladies first.
Oh, thank you. Well, off you go.
Okay, then I will. Okay, I'm Porn Panic on Twitter, and I have a Facebook page called Sex and Censorship. And you haven't even touched on our core subject, which mine and Paul's core subject, which is sex, but you have to do that another time.
I would like to have both of you on again for separate subjects other than Brexit. Brexit is just a good initial starting point for seeing where people lie on certain issues in terms of geopolitics. So it's always interesting to get their perspective. What about you, Paula?
Sorry, what you want me? What's the question?
Where can people find you?
Oh, right. I'm Sexy Isn't Sexist on Twitter. That's it, really. Come and I do stand-up comedy about defending, I don't know, heteronormative kind of stuff, and I'm just a kind of gadfly. Yeah, there you go.
Gotcha. All right, so go to Porn Panic and Sexy Isn't Sexist on Twitter. You can probably find the rest of their links from there as well. But this was a good conversation. I'm glad we had it. No matter where you lie on Brexit, share this with people so that they can get a better, broader understanding of where these things come from, because These ideas are not in a vacuum. And the idea that people just sprout up with the ideas that either party or many different parties think is bad is a cancer upon politics that I think must be excised. So I think the idea that these people come from rational perspectives, no matter what side of the fence they're proverbially on, I think that's a very valuable thing. So I hope you guys find them. If you disagreed with anything they have to say, you know where to find them. And you know where to find me if you think I'm full of shit. There's videos coming out. There's one that I'm in the works of making right now about how the war on cops is bullshit. So feel free to subscribe and like if you haven't already. And all of these things are brought to you by Liberty Professionals and Liberty Under Attack. So feel free to check out my sponsors by the links in the description. And also feel free to go and follow Polyquads Magazine on Twitter, because they're the reason that I got this discussion together. I've written 2 pieces for them so far, and I look forward to writing many more. If you want to get varying perspectives, they're a good place to get it. I'm not sponsored by them, although I did get paid for my work. But if you decide you want to support anybody, support them as well, because they're doing good work and trying to bring together diverse perspectives. But either way, all of this being said, this has been Jeremiah Harding. Smash the state.